Good morning. This is the fifth and final week of our series that we've been calling Cornerstone. We've looked at the importance of love and grace. We reflected on the Greek word ecclesia, which was the word Jesus used to describe the movement that he was building. Last week we looked at having a concern for the lost. The church exists to reach out to people who are far from God and bring them into a relationship with him. These foundational principles are foundational. They're basic, and yet every one of them can be easily lost sight of. So as we close out our series, we're going to look at one last word we often lose sight of, and to forget this word might be the strangest one of all. And that word is Jesus. In the gospel, we see Jesus after his triumphant entry into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday. He had recently raised Lazarus from the dead, and pretty much the situation is out of control. But with the raising of Lazarus, he sets in motion the events that would lead to Calvary. The crowds are cheering him as a king. The Jewish leaders are filled with jealousy, and the Roman authorities are starting to get worried about insurrection and revolt. We see Jesus goes to the temple where he overturns the money changers' tables and expels the merchants from the temple. He wades into controversy, disputing with all the various political and religious factions of the day. The Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Herodians, they all hate him. Why? Pretty much because he's taken their playbook when it comes to approaching God and has just thrown it out. The religious leaders who are entrusted with the care of God's family, the people of Israel, have made it so difficult to even try and live faithfully as a religious Jew that most ordinary people have simply walked away and given up trying. It was too difficult that nobody could do it. So in the midst of this alarming and amazing scene, what does Jesus do? He does what he always does. He tells a story. He says there was a landowner who planted a vineyard. He put a hedge around it, dug a wine press in it, and built a tower. Then he leased it to tenants and went on a journey. So this was something in that time that an entrepreneur would do. He would determine that a property was suitable for some investment, like a vineyard. He oversees the hard work and lays the foundation for a return on his investment. He plants the vineyard. He puts up a hedge and builds a tower to keep out wild animals and thieves that might damage or destroy or steal his harvest. He digs a wine press, which would have been a basin carved out of stone in which the grapes were crushed and drains into vats in which it fermented into wine. Then he rented the vineyard to farmers. That this was a typical situation in that region in the first century, that a wealthy landowner would set up a business arrangement with the local peasants, who otherwise would have been completely destitute. They work for him and get to share in the profits. But the profit in this case, the fruit of the vine, belongs to the landowner. Thus Jesus continues, when vintage time drew near, he sent his servants to the tenants to obtain his fruit. But the tenants seized the servants, one they beat, another they killed, and a third they stoned. Again, he sent out other servants more numerous than the first ones, but they treated them in the same way. This is outrageous. The landowner seeks what already belongs to him, the fruit of the vineyard he planted, that he owns, and these people who are supposed to be serving him withhold from him his fruit. The servants represent the prophets who God sent to the leaders of Israel time and time again, but the leaders mistreated them. But then it gets worse. But when the tenants saw the son, they said to one another, "This is the heir. Come, let us kill him and acquire his inheritance." They seized him, threw him out of the vineyard, and they killed him. This is so crazy. They kill the son, that it's an insane story. We know that in every parable Jesus ever tells, that the characters all represent someone else. Someone, for instance, usually represents God. And in this parable, that's obvious that it's the owner of the vineyard, which would mean that Jesus is the landowner's son, the one who is killed. And the tenants, that would doubtless be the religious leaders whom Jesus is telling this story to. But Jesus is such a master storyteller that they're not even thinking about that. They're so caught up in the narrative itself. And so Jesus asks them, what will the owner of the vineyard do to those tenants when he comes? With moral outrage and indignation at the very idea of this injustice and this breach of the established social order, they don't hesitate to answer. He will put those wretched men to a wretched death and lease his vineyard to tenants who will give him the fruit. Here comes the lesson that Jesus says to them, "Did you never read in the scriptures, the stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone? By the Lord has this been done, and it is wonderful in our eyes." Jesus tells the leaders that the Messiah, their long-awaited for Savior, is to be rejected by them, and then become the very cornerstone for that new movement God is building, which is the church. He's establishing a new movement that will produce the fruit, that will be successful in a way that they haven't been. Jesus is the cornerstone of our faith. Think about how amazing it is that we're talking about a Jewish carpenter who lived 2,000 years ago in the backwaters of the Roman Empire. That he never wrote a book, never held political office, or even made any money. He never did any of the things that usually make someone famous or worth remembering. He died the death of a criminal on the cross, rejected by his leaders. Yet, here we're talking about Jesus today. We're talking about him because he became the cornerstone of a movement that has lasted for more than 2,000 years. We're talking about him today because he is the stone rejected by the builders and who rose from the dead and conquered the grave. Why was Jesus rejected by these religious leaders? It was because he was successful and popular, and they were jealous. And the reason he was popular was because he was accessible and real. People loved to be with Jesus. They liked to eat with him and talk with him. That he was charismatic. They felt in him the presence of God's love and joy and peace. He didn't make a relationship with God seem so distant and far away. And while he was the holiest and most righteous person that ever lived, he didn't hold people's sins against them. He upheld both the importance of living morally and challenged others to do the same, but not in the way that was moralizing. The cornerstone of our faith is the person of Jesus Christ. We exist to lead people into a personal relationship with Jesus. Knowing Jesus is the single most important thing that can ever happen to anyone. The purpose of his life, death, and resurrection was to ransom us from our sins and to deliver us from the clutches of evil, to restore us to God. We exist to help people know Jesus and then become more like him. Everything we do is so that we will know Jesus in a personal way. The entire experience each weekend at Mass is designed to be an experience with Jesus. The liturgy is about Jesus. The Eucharist, the source and summit of our faith, of course, is all about Jesus Christ. And that all seems so obvious, but it turns out that it's actually easy for us to forget about bringing people into a relationship with Jesus. It can be easy to come to Mass and go through the motions and forget that it's about meeting with Jesus. It can be easy to forget about him. Church then becomes knowing facts about Jesus rather than truly knowing him. Church becomes about commitment to activity rather than commitment to Christ. It becomes about making sure people are living morally and enforcing the rules or maintaining a building. So as we conclude this series, I invite you to pray this simple prayer when you come to church each weekend. Jesus, I want to know you better. In fact, we can make it a prayer more than just when we come here. We can make it part of our prayer life each and every single day. You wake up in the morning, when you're driving your car, when you're brushing your teeth. Make that simple prayer. Jesus, I want to know you better. Jesus, I want to know you better.